So our team for the seminar series is Clemens Schmidt, who's providing us technical assistance, and Anna Chukovic, PhD student in anthropology department, who is also the coordinator of the seminar series on forced migration. We want to welcome you to the first event of seminar series on forced migration in 2022. We have started the seminar series at the end of 2020. We welcome Professor Paula Banerjee from Calcutta University and Mahanirban Research Group, who will be giving a talk titled The Conundrum of Trafficking and Statelessness in South Asia. The seminar series on forced migration is part of Europe-Asia Research Platform on forced migration, anchored at IWM, Vienna, and Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group, CRG in Calcutta. And it is hosted at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Vienna. For those of you who are not familiar to the Europe-Asia Research Platform, please allow me to say a couple of words. This Europe-Asia Research Platform on forced migration aims to advance the cooperation between European and South Asian institutions and academics while working toward creating a joint research platform for innovative knowledge production on forced migration and bordering regimes, bringing together scholars, policymakers, and practitioners from different disciplines and regions. The seminar series aspires to decentering scholarship, debates, and policies on forced migration. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to remind you that the seminar is being recorded. And we will have a question and answer session after the presentation. Please feel free to pose your questions in the chat portion of the webinar throughout the presentation, and we will read them afterwards during the discussion. Please note that the questions might not be taken in the order that they are written, and that might be sometimes I might put the questions together because of time constraints. Now, please allow me to introduce our distinguished speaker. Professor Banerjee is best known for her work on women in borderlands and women and forced migration. She's a faculty member of the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies, University of Calcutta, among many other appointments and memberships. If I start to reading you those membership, then we will be stealing from our talk time. So I will not do that. She is the current editor of the journal Refugee Watch, and please allow me to say that the last issue of the journal Refugee Watch is actually which is entitled Displacements and Dispossessions, brings the Europe-Asia Research Platform on forced migration scholars there. This is the number 58, I think. Winner of Paula Banerjee is winner of many of awards and accolades, and in 2013 she was awarded the Distinguished Fulbright Sir Award and the Visiting Professorship at SUNY Oswego. Her recent publications include Statelessness in South Asia, 2016, Unstable Populations, Anxious States, edited 2013, Women in Indian Borderlands, 2012, and Borders, Histories, Existences, Gender and Beyond, 2010, which has been acclaimed as a bestseller. She has written and edited over 15 books and monographs and published widely in international journals such as Journal of Borderland Studies, Canadian Journal of Women's Studies, Forced Migration Review, and Journal of International Studies. Acknowledged as a radical and prolific speaker, she had delivered lectures in all 5 continents. She has been a visiting professor in a number of universities, including Helsinki, Yunnan University in China, University of Paris 7 in France, and New School, among others. She is the former Vice Chancellor of Sanskrit University and the President of International Association for Studies in Forced Migration and former Director of Calcutta Research Group. We are very proud that Paula Banerjee had accepted our invitation. Professor Banerjee, the floor is yours now. We are all looking forward to your talk, The Conundrum of Trafficking and Statelessness in South Asia. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Professor Çağlar. Ayşe Çağlar, again, is a prolific writer and a scholar, particularly on cityscapes, and this is something that from her writing, I have tried to inculcate in my work. Today, I will talk a little bit, and she also happens to be a very good friend, and I always say, ask your friends to introduce you, and they do the best job, as you saw. Well, I will not read anything. I will talk, because I always think of myself as a storyteller, true to Indian, tradition and legacy. I tell stories. And as Foucault had once commented, that I write nothing that is anything but fiction. So most of what I'm saying is probably fiction, because most of my calculations are guess estimates, because I'm working here for a group of people where nobody on earth has the correct statistics. I can promise you the last wager that whatever statistics you get on this are guess estimates. I'm talking about statelessness and trafficking. We often throw numbers of 4 million to 40 million people who can be stateless, and the same about trafficking. But why have I used this as a dyad in the backdrop of a cityscape is something that I will explain. But I will begin about my interest on this issue because of, again, a story. And there is somebody here, I saw the name fleetingly, Sucharita Sengupta. I think she's here. She was with me when this peculiar situation happened. Sucharita Sengupta was with me doing the research. She was my research assistant at that point in time. Now she's doing her PhD from Institute of Human Sciences, I think it's called, Graduate Institute, sorry, in Geneva. Now we were working on the situation of Bangladeshi migrant women in 6 jails of West Bengal. We are both awaiting our books on this. So, probably you've never written, you've read a little bit of what has been written on this topic, but this was a amazing, absolutely amazing experience for both of us. And Sucharita and me one day went to the Dum jail. In the Dum jail, the person who was, we have a welfare officer in jails. And these were actually very well-meaning people. I mean, whenever you think of incarceration, you think of jails, inevitably you talk about violence, you talk about, victimhood, you talk about, all kinds of violations. But in this case, this particular person was actually, in a very colloquial way, a nice guy. He would, lift the children, the babies in his lap, walk around with them. And we went multiple times. So, it wasn't an acting out of any role. And this guy was really, really concerned because there were 13 women in his jail. He just did not know what to do with them because these 13 women were jailed with the Bangladeshi women, but they did not speak the same language. They had nothing to prove that they were Bangladeshi citizen. He did not understand the dialogue. He did not understand the papers that they were trying to show. Nobody understood the papers that they were trying to show. And so when we tried to interview the Bangladeshi women, he was desperate. He told us that there is this group of 13 women. We cannot even put them in front of a judge because we don't know under what act they can be either, caught, kept. There can be any legislation. He has no idea what to do with them. So he was like at his death's end. He said, Professor Banerjee and Sucharita was a much kinder person than me. He said, can you just at least meet them? Now we are, doing research, we become very selfish people. We just concentrate on our microscopic group of people that we want to talk to. But, Sucharita and me, we decided, okay, there is this 13 women. They do not have any change of clothes. They have nothing, and they're there with children and they're there for days in this particular jail. They're not being taken in front of a judge. They don't know whether they will have to stay in this jail. And the peculiar thing is, if you are incarcerated and if there is some kind of a case going on against you, you will not get any change of clothes. Only when you become the guest of the state, that is, you are jailed actually after your conviction, that is when you get change of clothes or any kind of amenities or any, wage, anything. So can you imagine 13 women wearing the same sari for 6 months? They would wash half of the sari and wear the other half. And, probably one or two NGOs tried to give them a change of clothes and all. But the desperation, these people had no idea what is going to happen to them. And they are Rohingyas. That is exactly where I am getting, because they spoke, Mohammed Bilal, you hit the nail on the head. When they came to us, they spoke a dialect which was very similar to the language that is spoken in Chittagong Hill Tracts, part of that. But we had huge problems in understanding, other than the empathic language of womanhood. So, that is when we decided to work with them and realized that they were Rohingya women. And the state had absolutely no idea what to do to them. Now, I am not, I am not of the believer that state doesn't have an iron hand. I'm not saying that the state is a very soft entity. A lot of us today, nowadays, we talk about the very fragile sort of a state, but I still believe, the state has enormous power, but even that state had no idea how to deal with a stateless group. The reason why I think of this particular incident is because I think statelessness as a problem is huge, because it robs the stateless of the dignity of being a human being, pretty much. Because, in our statist mental image, population groups are divided on the basis of citizenship. It is not, stateless people are not in our mental map. So often we talk about laws, but most of the laws, legislations, even international treaties are for communities who have been marked as stateless. So you have to be somebody, some government have to tell you that this person is stateless. It is very interesting. If you have a boy or a girl living in your household and this person leaves your household, you can always say this person doesn't belong to my household. But can you say that this person doesn't have any households? You cannot. And that is the exact conundrum with stateless people. How can anybody say that they are stateless? Because I'm not calling them Bangladeshi, excuse me. I've never called them Bangladeshi. I will respond to the questions later. Because you see, you cannot call them stateless. However, you can say that they're not representatives of my state. That is one aspect that is acceptable. But to call a community stateless means you are depriving that community or person or group of their intrinsic right given to them by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. UDHR, we all know Article 15 clearly states that it is human right to have a nationality, and nobody can be deprived of that right without the due process of law. But, often due to excess of statism, many people are deprived of their citizenship. Often we have seen in the case of Rohingya, when a particular definition of citizenship is, formulated, people tend to lose their rights to citizenship. Now, the question here remains, there is hardly any international treaty or any international law that tells the state in which situation a person would be a citizen. It tells that a person has the right to nationality, but there is no legal provision for telling that this person will have the citizenship of this particular state under these conditions. So, in terms of right to nationality of population groups and state sovereignty, we have seen that state sovereignty is often rated much higher, as a result of which huge communities have become stateless now. Now, the other part of my talk is about the trafficked population, because the trafficked population are actually the orphans even within the stateless community. You see, even now, UNHCR recognizes groups that are considered as de jure stateless and groups that are considered as de facto stateless. Some are de jure by law, some are de facto by practice. They become stateless. However, there are provisions for largely the de jure population groups, but the de facto population groups do not have such provisions or do not enjoy unless there is a recognition that they are a stateless community. Now, the problematic thing about, our own imagination is that even when we think of statelessness, we think in terms of nationality, ethnicity. So we recognize, Bhutanese refugees as stateless. We recognize Rohingyas as stateless. We recognize, multiple groups, ethnicities, communities as stateless. But there is another population group, which is largely, if I might call, the issue-based population groups. These groups are not defined on the basis of nationality. These groups are not defined on the basis of ethnicity. They might be defined on the basis of gender, but, they become displaced or they become dispossessed or their rights are eroded, and ultimately they become de facto stateless. And here I am talking about the trafficked population. Why am I talking about the trafficked population in the context of South Asia? Because if you look at world statistics, you will see that even now it is recognized that 40% of the trafficked people in the world are either living in South Asia or being generated from South Asia. So this is a huge group of people. DFID, USAID, etc., will tell you that the ultimate goal of this community is probably to go to United States or to go to Europe. But the interesting part is over 80% of this population remain in areas very close to from where they were dispossessed. Mobility needs resources. Without resources, mobility becomes challenged. And dispossessed groups lack the resources. And that is why when this group of vulnerable population groups become dispossessed, that is, you will see, right in front of your eyes, the whole thing unfolding in the case of Ukraine. And God help me, but here I think we should all pray that peace returns. In conflicts, again, people get dispossessed. Today only, I was listening to a family who was dispossessed, and the family became, displaced from their homes. They were running from their homes. So they settled within a matter of 2 weeks. They were displaced 3 times. So displacement has its own sort of logic. Once you're displaced multiple times. And then it becomes a very sort of a narrow passage towards contacting people who can help them. And that is pretty much who traffickers are. People you contact or people who contact you telling they will aid in your mobility. Now, why do traffickers thrive? Because cities have a need for these dispossessed population. This is the precariat of the city, which becomes the spinal cord of the labor system that is needed for a city to survive. So where do large groups of trafficked population go? They go to cities within Asia. It can be in the Middle East, it can be in South Asia or Southeast Asia, or they go to Africa. Very seldom are they able to go to Europe or United States. So you see this whole nexus between trafficking and protracted traffic community invariably become stateless. Because even though trafficking is considered as something that is debarred on the basis of international law, but what happens in the process is that trafficking also becomes an underground movement. And because it is debarred, people become so much victimized and violated that they lose their citizenship in the process. They lose because citizenship is based on some legal attributes that has to be written, codified, etc. And you join the ranks of a sans-papier population whose citizenship is hardly ever registered. You become trafficked. You don't have any papers. You don't have any understanding of this whole registration process. You don't have any means to prove your citizenship. And sometimes proving citizenship also becomes precarious because you go to areas where your citizenship can make you doubly vulnerable. Yet your labor is needed. Your survival is based on that labor. So that is why you create this nexus between the stateless population who then become trafficked, or the trafficked who then become stateless. It can work both ways. Statelessness creates huge uncertainties, huge vulnerabilities, and that is when the traffickers help you out or harm you, whatever. But this false dyad or this false debate, people being either trafficked or smuggled, is something which is, again, I would call it a lack of politics. It is a neoliberal way of trying to understand the economy, which is being shorn of politics. I don't understand this division between smuggling and trafficking. I don't normally, as a sensible human being, protest against things which I don't understand, but this is something that needs to be protested because you are assuming that a stateless person will have the voice to either be smuggled, which means you approach the traffickers, or trafficked when they are forcefully taken. That is a false premise. So, smuggled people can become trafficked people then become smuggled, etc. It is not such a clear-cut picture. But these people are then taken up from one area, and the moment they cross international border, their situation becomes even more problematic. Interesting, some of the interesting facts that we get when we do a little bit of research is that in the context of South Asia, trafficking is still considered as either the highest, or in some literature, the second highest organized crime in South Asia. And here, I mean trafficking of people, not of narcotics or arms, because the division is either trafficking in narcotics or arms, or trafficking in people. So trafficking in people is either one of the highest organized crimes or the second highest organized crimes. In one research undertaken by journalists of Reuters, it is stated that among the 20 million trafficked people that are there in the context of South Asia, 3/4 are women. So therein comes the thing that informs my talk today, and that is the whole notion of gender. Gender, we always think of gender binaries, but life is not always based on gender binaries. But women and the other genders form 3/4 of the trafficked population today in the context of South Asia. So, if we need to address this whole issue of statelessness, because otherwise there is no imagination, no imaginary space for a population group, because unless you can club them within some state, you cannot think of them as human beings having rights. And that is what happens to large group of trafficked populations whose labor becomes very, very important in the context of cities which are built on this labor. Of course, yes, I am including girls. Children, no. I do not want to have a separate statistics for Jessica for women and children, because a lot of the girls share the same and sometimes more vulnerabilities than the women. So, again, among the trafficked population, male to even female, other genders, etc., what happens is that sexual vulnerability is there for everyone, for the trafficked population. But this sort of an increased violence within sexual vulnerability. So, Chris Dolan always talks about how sexual vulnerability and violence gets transposed. And often we talk about violence instead of sexual vulnerabilities. So, yes, both of these get transposed. And this violence is then directed much more to female and the other genders than it is directed to even boys, teenage boys. I am not talking about absolute violence or sexual vulnerability. Violence is faced by all, but if you look at the gradation of sexual vulnerability towards the women and also even more towards the other gender, we have seen it to be directed. Recently, during the COVID times, world over, we have seen a huge increase in the number of trafficked population. Now, if we take South Asia, South Asian countries, all of these South Asian countries have laws and legal means to stop trafficking. But why is it never stopped? Recently, only in as recent times as I think 2018, for the first time, we saw that a couple was jailed for life for trafficking in young girl children. 9 girls were discovered from an area in northeastern India. It is called Gaya, from where 9 girls were saved, rescued by the police, by the state, and it was a very difficult task to ask these girls to sort of represent themselves, risked their life. They agreed to be, there for giving evidence against their traffickers. As a result of this, for the first time, we see a conviction for life in India against a trafficked, a couple who have been actively trafficking people. Now, so with this whole conundrum of trafficking and statelessness, which is in certain ways has a multiple effect, and it creates the violation of basic rights of human beings, we have crisis times, that is COVID. Today, there is a war going on. So the people of that region become quadruply violated, quadruply victimized. And, with each of these crises, our understanding after our research is that these communities become even more rightless. World over, we have seen that over 230 million people have dropped below poverty line during the pandemic. And as a result of this, many more young teenage children have become victims of trafficking. What do you do? I have asked this question previously, but often, there are NGO groups that takes a moralistic view about groups that are trafficked. But what do you do when your only social capital is your body? You trade on your body. To survive, you trade on your body. And I'm not valorizing it. It is just the way of life. If you see your children starving, if you see your, parents dying of hunger, if you see you're being being displaced as a result of your poverty, you agree to be trafficked. So please do not take the trafficked communities as insensitive, stupid, unaware. They are not, because there is another fact that cannot be, challenged, and that is people who are called victims of trafficking 80% of the times do not give away who their, they do not give away their traffickers to the population that is meant to protect them. To them, the people who are meant to protect them often become violators, whereas the people who have actually violated their trust, like the traffickers, they are more closer to them, because it is a known fact that more than 70% of the traffickers are people that that you are aware of, just like rape victims, people who rape you are people often enough are closest to you that you know. It is the same for traffickers. They're people that you trust. I interviewed a girl now she's 42 years old. Her name is Mili Noshkar. I interviewed her. She came from a village in remote part of West Bengal to the brothel in Kolkata. Now, mind you, most trafficking people who are trafficked are not trafficked for sex. They ultimately slide into that population. Even today, the highest number of people who are trafficked for labor. And that is why sex becomes part of the continuum of that labor that you engage in so that you survive. And this girl, she is now middle-aged woman of 42 or 43, but she came to Kolkata when she was 13, and she was brought by one of her cousin sisters from a village. And she said that in her village at that point of time, she was starving. So her parents told her that Didi will recruit you and take you to the city so that you can earn money. And she went with this Didi, which in Bengal means older sister, to the city. And while they were going, she figured that Didi is taking her someplace which might be unsavory. But when they landed in Kolkata, she told this woman who is her trafficker that I'm hungry. And this woman stopped at a place, gave her 2 slices of bread and an egg to eat and a cup of tea with milk. She said, I never had such filling food for days and days and days. That is when I decided, whatever this woman is telling me to do, I will do. At least I will have a full stomach of food. At least I will be able to send money to my family back home. At least my young siblings would survive. I also spoke to multiple women at this time, to see how these groups were being trafficked, who have been trafficked. Again, that is a vulnerable section of the population. They have survived the COVID. So, a lot of them, they, whether they are labor in the laboring communities or whether they're working as sex workers. Or now, one thing I have to tell you, it's different to do studies in sex works from in my location in Bengal, because sex workers have been unionized in Bengal and the state have recognized their unionization. This is the union that we call deprives, which is very, very exceptional. And they also have formed a cooperative for their lives. So it is very different. And that is why I hate to look at them as, this umbrella victimhood. They're not victims. They're quite aware. They're quite sensitive. Often they make a choice because the choice is survival or death. It is that's, charged a matter. So these people then, to survive, they get into sex work. But often enough, before coming into sex work, a lot of this population group, what they do is they try to also survive through other sort of labors. In that, there can be building trade, but because of Narega, the scheme that a lot of South Asian countries have, it is difficult to get jobs in these building trades and all, because poorer sections of the population are given that job. And now, the thing about South Asia is that, unlike in a lot of other places, the whole notion, we often mark Bangladesh or Nepal as transition, as countries from where groups of women, are generated, so they then become trafficked. However, that would be a very simplistic assumption. All of South Asian states produce women who are ultimately trafficked. All of South Asian states are also, states of transition. Because look at the situation of Rohingya groups. Bangladesh can be seen as the transition place, where many of them have been given refugeehood, many are not, but they find a space. Then from there, they try to migrate to India, from India to Pakistan, etc. In Pakistan, we have roads that are called Arakanabad and all of that. So all of these states have groups from where they originate. These are also transition places, and these are also places where these groups come and settle down. And the other thing that I have to tell you is that these groups, after settling down, they become protracted stop-up-here group. And that is where this whole notion of statelessness kicks in, whether they be, able to get the right to vote, whether they can get papers to go to other countries, whether they can seek asylum. All of these is dependent on this notion of citizenship. And because that notion is challenged as a result of protracted statelessness, protracted, these groups who are trafficked then becomes dispossessed of their ability to force the recognition that they're citizens of a certain area, because they're trafficked because of their socio-economic political condition. But citizenship, again, is a recognition of a certain political status. So these are in contradiction to each other. So, you as a trafficked community find it extremely difficult to prove your citizenship, especially if you come from a community that is not used to the position of papers, that is not used to knowing even what citizenship is all about. And then, you are asking then to these communities to make a choice between survival or proving your citizenship. So their choice would be survival. So unless, we recognize that these population groups are dispossessed because of certain socio-political and economic vulnerability, because most of these groups are people who are largely from minority communities. Most of these groups are people who are from indigenous communities. And if you look at the gender, as I said, 3/4 of them belong to the feminine gender or to other genders, if we can club them under other genders, and not masculine. So that is why trafficking becomes a very, very gendered problem. And then, accessing the right to citizenship for these communities who have not been trained to access right to citizenship because of their gender, because of their political affiliations, etc., then finds it very, very difficult. Now, the other group who are also in certain ways trafficked are, the brides. Often they are not mail order brides, but they're brides from one region to another. And during this COVID period, we saw the increased number of young and teenage brides being transported from one region to another. I interviewed a particular person who was being transported to be married off to a mentally challenged man in India, in northern India, and this person was being trafficked from Bangladesh. So, within crisis period, the number of these groups become higher. And again, it is poverty and lack of rights that create a situation where their, rights become more and more eroded, and ultimately they join the ranks of de facto stateless population. And yet, when we talk of statelessness, our imaginary does not let us include this group of trafficked population. We are always talking about either Bhutanese or Arakanese or, on the basis of a space that they belong to. But these are much more dispersed population, and they are, they become dispossessed because of either their gender or because of their socio-economic situation. And so it becomes particularly problematic for them to access their rights. And because they have got into the state of rightlessness through a route that is seldom recognized as the route for accessing rights, they become particularly dispossessed, and their number is a huge number. That is why I think we should not segregate discussion of trafficking and statelessness and actually include the trafficked population within this question of statelessness, especially at the backdrop of a city, because, as I said, within the cityscape, within the imaginary of the city, you have the labor of these population groups. So unless there is some effort to bring rights to these population groups, it would be very difficult to address the question of statelessness. Without addressing the question of statelessness, we will not be able to access the question of rights and the question of justice, ethics, and peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paula, for this wonderful and very passionate talk, which I think marks your contributions always, and which is very dear to scholarship, I think. There is everything but no indifference in your talks, which is, I think, really, really makes it valuable. And before opening the floor to the questions, and I see already some questions in the chat, I would like to underline a couple of things which I thought that were very, very important in your talk, in a way that what you show us, how looking at the gender and trafficking are crucial in their intersection, crucial to understand statelessness beyond laws, citizenship-centered understanding of statelessness, that beyond those kinds of binaries, so that we could move outside of the binary. And it is, in a way, actually the way that you bring how not just the gender dimension per se, but it's in combination how it is so much overrepresented in the trafficked populations, and how the trafficked populations actually fall through certain kinds of registers, so that and leads and then enables us to see the dynamics and the processes involved in the creation of formation of statelessness, because statelessness is a process and it is made. It is and this making of that statelessness is not necessarily about whether you have this de jure rights or this in terms of legal rights or not. And it is also interesting, I think, that in terms of the de facto statelessness, in a way, it becomes bottom of the bottom in a way, because it does not even have the recognition of its statelessness in opposition to the legally defined statelessness. And I think these are very important points to explore statelessness from a very narrow perspective, and how the states are really creating this, but not being able to deal with that. And also, I think it is about the trafficked, is that when you are talking about the trafficked, is always about the right to survive rather than other kinds of rights. Then I think we get into the bottom line of the crucial aspects of how dispossessions and displacements are a crucial part of the formation and making and unmaking of the stateless communities. So I think it is it's very interesting in terms of the way that you unpacked the process of statelessness through the lens of trafficked and trafficked women particularly. I have one question. You might pick it up now or later. When you were talking about underground movements and underground kind of dynamics, from those trafficked women, especially in the way that you, I mean, in South Asia, do you see any kind of, I'm not saying kind of the solidarity kind of movements, but a kind of visceral kind of visceral dynamics of resistance or acquisition of rights beyond the kind of the canonical rights. So is there a kind of an underground of statelessness of the trafficked woman? If you wish, you can pick that up, or if you wish, I could start with the questions. But thanks a lot. I think it's a very important lens that you provide us to the statelessness.
Yeah, I will address this question of resistance. There is, when I talk about the underground, the whole process, if we look at it from the canonical aspects of law, is an underground movement. That is why it is considered as illegal, but it can be considered as illegal because legality is something very different, but it cannot be considered as immoral because, as I look at it, it's from the lens, you're very correct about that, of survival. And there is today this huge network, often groups call them the evil network of traffickers. Perhaps there are these very evil people, but to a lot of these, particularly people who access trafficking for mobility, that is the last resort. Often that is the easy resort. Often, and it is like being the cohort of a population group. Once you are not individually trafficked, you're trafficked in groups, and you form networks of that. And that is why that even if you're jailed, thrown back across the border, you have to access the same networks to come back. And if you feel that your survival is based on that, and who gives you these network spaces? What are these capillaries? These capillaries are formed of your cohorts who are in touch or who then become traffickers themselves. So, and parents know about that all the time, but they depend on this group. So parents, the mother could have been trafficked, the father could have been trafficked, their children then accesses the same networks. They're aware that these people can be thrown off and, can enter the brothels, can enter, laboring groups and, all of that. Then why do they allow them? Because again, it is a question of surviving. And unless we survive, what rights do we have? Death robs us of all dignity and rights. So for survival, any mechanism, I think, is a legitimate mechanism. Because the primary aspect, the most intrinsic right that we have is the right to life. And if I consider my right to life as the most intrinsic right that I possess, how can I be moralistic and say that somebody else's right to life is less than my own? So yes, there are networks. Yes, these are underground networks. Yes, people often call them as evil networks, but often they serve a purpose. And because they serve a purpose, they exist.
Okay, thank you very much, Paula. That is, and then I would like to also add something in terms of where you started with those 13 women in jail, where that they didn't know what to do with that, and actually, and they were at a kind of a situation, and then it is not even a protracted displacement, but it is protracted limbo, and which is the most dangerous, vulnerable state. And even in terms of, if you are in terms of the jail and the prison system, we know that the most violence, the highest vulnerability is before you come into the part of the judiciary, in a way, at least at the kind of the court. This is where the most of the torture happens. This is where that the most of the violence happens, because you are in between, you are in limbo, you are under responsibility of no one, in a way, where the law is not for you. So what you are showing is that in a way that kind of, that's why I think I like that the jail start of with these 13 women, that they are a threat to the system, but they are very much vulnerable. Everyone could do everything with these people. And so it is like this protracted limbo. I thought that this was a very interesting way of starting your talk. But let's take the questions. We have several questions. There was some kind of a question about that. Why are you identifying them as Bangladeshis, or why don't you refer them as displaced Myanmar citizens? And I think you responded saying that you were not saying them as identifying as the Bangladeshis, but you didn't say anything in terms of how you would identify them, whether like displaced Myanmar citizens or not. If you would like to take that one, clarify, add something to what you have said before that, before we go to the other questions. This was Bilal Hossain who posed that question.
Yeah, to me, that's a false question. It is tautology. I mean, how does it matter if I recognize that they are displaced Myanmar citizen? Are they getting the citizenship, the rights of citizenship? I would be in the front line trying to fight for their citizenship. But unless we as a group recognize that citizenship, unless the United Nations empowers us to do it, of course I call them Myanmaris. But, does it then absolve me of my responsibility to give them the life that they deserve? Or, is that not our easy way of out and saying that, oh my God, yes, they are displaced Myanmaris, but who cares about them? I think I go a bit further, and I recognize that they are, as you say, in a liminal space, in the space of limbo, where they're not being able to access any rights. And I have gone to, camps that are legal, camps that are illegal. There's a huge difference between their groups. And I'm not part of any state mechanism. I don't give a damn that who legalizes some communities of refugees and who doesn't. To me, every human being has the right to survive with dignity and with the rights that gives them that dignity, or the dignity that gives them that right, and these people are being dispossessed of that right. So yes, if somebody is happy to call them as displaced Myanmaris, so be it, let them call them that. To me, the question is much deeper.
Okay, thank you, Paula, for this very clear answer. There is a question from Ngozi Louis Uzoma. Excellent presentation, Professor Banerjee. I am Ngozi Uzoma from University of Nigeria. Are there no stipulated pathways to citizenship for these stateless groups, irrespective of how long they stay in Bangladesh? Just like in northeastern Indian states of Assam, Nagaland, Manipur, and Mizoram, how do religion and ethnicity interact to endanger statelessness in Bangladesh? And then adds that my question is channeled towards India, not Bangladesh. Are there no, yeah, okay, this is the same one. So.
I'm sorry, I missed part of the question. Can you repeat the question? Because I think it's a very crucial question.
Yes. Are there no stipulated pathways to citizenship for the stateless groups, irrespective of how long they stay in Bangladesh? Are there any kind of paths to have access, at least kind of in the legalistic way, certain rights, just like in northern eastern India states of Assam, Nagaland, Manipur, and Mizoram? How do religion and ethnicity interact to engender statelessness in Bangladesh?
Yeah, and you said your question is channeled towards India. Yes, of course. I think I'm understanding a little bit of it. And yes, there are always stipulated legal mechanisms for people to become, it's very difficult to be a nationalized citizen. If you're not born as a citizen, to be a nationalized citizen, it's extremely difficult. But your access point, your entry point has to be a legal mechanism. If you join the community of people who are underground, who are not, how do you even prove that you've come to a particular country on a certain date, or you've been a resident of that country for a certain period? I will give you the example of the snake charmers in Bangladesh. We, with Meghna Gutakuta from Bangladesh, had to take up this case, and we were working in tandem because these snake charmers were caught. I think this was 2004, if I'm not mistaken. And I visited their houses in Bangladesh and also in our part of India. Now, it was very interesting because these groups of snake charmers, they had their resident permit from certain district magistrates from a district in West Bengal. Yet in Bangladesh, they owned property. They did not claim to any kind of citizenship, because by claiming to citizenship of a certain particular country at that point of time would have robbed them of the mobility that was required for their survival, because their income generation was based on their mobility, and they could cross borders at will, go from India to Dubai, from Dhaka to Dubai, and come back and settle in certain places for certain periods of time. So, what you do with this group of population, not just the snake charmers, but whose access point, whose entry point is outside the pale of that legality. And that is what I'm talking about. We always think of it in terms of laws which are based on states. Even international laws are geared towards states. But this is a group of people, the trafficked or the people like the snake charmers, who challenge the notion of state, because state is tied to a certain spatial formation. So they challenge that spatial formation. Their entry point is not through a recognition of their statehood. Their entry point is through a recognition of their humanity. So when they enter it in that access from a completely different entry point, then becoming a citizen becomes even more challenging, because, to access, citizenship, there is a pathway to access. But these people were derailed from that pathway to begin with. So how do you access citizenship?
Okay, thank you very much. There is another one from Bandana Purkayashta. Dr. Banerjee, you're correct. We also record in the book Human Trafficking that without changing the structural marginalization, practices such as rescues, shelters, etc. do not work. The trafficked people circulate through exploitation for sex, to labor, to selling organs. Farhan Navid Yosef's work on Pakistan reflects this too. If you would like to comment or add to that, you're welcome to. And I will take another question. Francis Solomantina, in terms of redress mechanisms by the diplomatic missions in the Middle East region, trafficked women victims face immense challenges where access to justice does not harmonize with the definition of human trafficking, and those who seek to support the diplomatic missions are treated similarly to undocumented migrants. What needs to be improved in order to overcome such issues? Thank you. And I think this is also in a way what you are referring in your talk, that these people become quasi sans papier, although so I think there is that kind of an allegation in that question. So maybe we pick these two because of time, and then respond.
Yeah. I mean, both are excellent questions. Thank you, Bandana. You yourself have done wonderful work on all of these issues. And now the thing is, you're so right. For me, these are all false sort of borders, whether they are, daily wage laborers, or they are sex workers, or the only line that I'll draw is organ donation. I think that happens in extreme depravity, and sometimes through, again, this whole question of consent. I have to talk about the question of consent. How do we define consent? What is consent? In all of this, and so I think for huge groups of population, this whole notion of consent is a neoliberal notion. So where does consent come into it? And in terms of organ donation, to make your young children survive, if you have to give up a kidney, you do that. Do you need to give your consent? Or if somebody is kidnapped and their kidney is taken away, then the only trade-off difference is the money. Where does consent come into it? When can we say that you consent to do this? And how can we say that, the Palermo Protocol, I think the one good thing that it talks about is this falsity of consent in all of this, whether you agree to sell yourself or not. Where does this agreement come? In situations where you find yourself, often enough, there is no notion of agreement for that, and that is why I get very angry when people talk about, are they taken outside because of their consent, or they're taken because they do not consent? These are all false premises. The premise that we have to discuss is that you're a human being, you have to survive, whether we dignify that survival, invest that survival with rights or not. The other things that we have are frills, and frills don't matter.
Okay. Thank you. Paula, do you want to pick up the other question in terms
Which
of
one?
This was the redress mechanisms in diplomatic missions, Middle East region, and they're treated as undocumented migrants, and what needs to be improved in order to overcome such issues. I mean, in a way, they are treated as undocumented because they're all seen like through the state. They're always seen as through the lens of the state. But please.
Yeah, they are, at least here we are talking about undocumented migrants, because people often call them illegal. How can a life be illegal? Where is legality in personhood? I mean, what are we talking about? So yes, they're undocumented migrants. The regressal mechanism is very, very tough. I have been, I don't know who asked this question, but yes, I've been involved in some of these groups, some of these research activities. The Stimson Institute, facilitated our journey to Lebanon and to discuss these things with the missions, and the missions themselves find it very difficult. And also, redressal to what? How do you redress a situation where the people concerned are not willing to or cannot come upfront and talk about the violations? They are not empowered to talk about the violations. They cannot, if their survival is in question, because then they have to go back to their country. And often we talked about the Stockholm Syndrome, where, there was this particular Sri Lankan woman whose case we were very concerned about. She was a domestic worker in the Middle East. And, what happened was, hi, Jennifer, thanks for coming in. What happened was this woman had an abusive owner, sort of, quote unquote, where she worked. Now, her mission told her that in terms of legality, there was very little they could do, but they rescued her and took her to a safe house and said, you are never to go back to that particular employer. But then she was facing this whole crisis about sending money home. And this employer owed 6 months of her wage. So she clandestinely went back to get that wage, and she was killed in the process. Whether she died, the verdict was suicide, but whether that was accidental death or whether that was murder, nobody really could work that out. And then, the whole question turned around the notion of why she went back even when she was rescued. But that is the complexity of the question. She deserved that fate. And her survival of her family, her existence, not even, it's not even just bodily survival. You have your own notion of existence. And that existence is on the basis of certain dignity. And that dignity comes from you being the breadwinner of the family. And if you rob that person of that dignity and keep her in hiding, then that person may not want to accept that sort of a safe house. Then that house is certainly not safe, because you are basically incarcerating a person because she's been violated. So there should be better redressal mechanism. These are very, very painstaking mechanism, very problematic, even after legal activism of decades. It's still difficult to access justice in all of this. So yes, there should be better redressal mechanism, particularly in a lot of this petrodollar country where a lot of the people are taken as laborers, but their documentation or non-documentation depends on the state where they're taken, because the whole process of taking them, if not through the proper channels. See, a lot of these African countries, I've recently worked with ILO on that, are trying to develop these proper channels of sending laboring people, and trying to access, digital payment mechanisms. There are pluses and minuses for all of that, but, we have to be more creative, because this problem is out of the box. So we cannot, get the box over it to create redressals, to create solutions to this problem. So there has to be different modes of thinking. And that is what I, as a scholar activist, am pushing for. That, both theoretically, we have to push the margins, because this is not, the entry point itself is not the entry point that is marked through the state mechanisms or through the legal mechanisms or through sovereignty rights. And so the whole passage is different. And unless we have solutions that address it, we would be denying justice to huge groups of human beings.
Thanks a lot, Paula. That is, it's always good to have a reminder that this is not a question of perfection of the state sovereignty and state system. That is so that we could cover everything that, to work against those vulnerabilities. I have one, Skarita Sengupta adds, I think, that is to add to Professor Banerjee, the group is recognized both as both refugees and stateless by UNHCR and named under several categories that can also be questioned. I think this is additional.
I think she's talking about the Rohingyas, because I know her research is based on Rohingyas. Yes, that's again, that is something that we have been pushing for, because we had a huge debate with UNHCR, where this question of recognizing them as citizens of certain countries, but they cannot be recognized as citizens of certain countries because these countries don't recognize them. And the right to recognize people who, the citizenship of a person does not remain with the person concerned. It is with the state. And that is where my problem lies with Mr. Bilal Hussein's question as to whether we recognize anybody as a citizen of a certain country. Because at the end of the day, it is the country that recognizes, that gives that citizenship. So, that is why UNHCR is supposed to consider them as refugees, not as citizens, but as refugees. But we pushed for the fact that they, once you are also recognized as stateless, you can access some rights as stateless. So we as CRG, even with our partners, and we've been working with a lot of, scholars, organizations, scholarly organizations and NGOs throughout South Asia to push for recognition of the Rohingyas as stateless as well, so that these communities can access both the rights of a refugee and the rights of a stateless.
Thank you. I think this is a very important clarification. I will just collect then, because of time, some of the questions from Rajat. Thanks for your excellent lecture. My question is related to the sex workers and their view on trafficking. I want to know your opinion about treating quote unquote sex work as a crime and providing sexual services to the client as a penal offense. Isn't this violating the right to livelihood? I think you have this right to life that you have expanded quite a lot. We would like, if you wish, you could expand on it more, but I will take another one too from Paredes Grijalva and Marta Daniel. Thank you for Banerjee for connecting all of these issues: citizenship, access to rights beyond neat legal categories, gender, labor, profit, and more. As a former worker from a migrant organized center working with trafficked women and girls, I can only reinforce what you have said. While international instruments and national laws may distinguish between smuggling and trafficking, learning from lived realities of people as we do through ethnographic research reveals that they are not necessarily separate things. It's complicated. On resistance and going beyond victimhood, I would be interested in hearing if you have more to add, for instance, from your fieldwork, narratives, art, or any off interactions where people strategically employ the term victim. That is another question. So from those, these are the last two ones, and then I think we have to close the session, come to closing the session slowly. Okay.
Okay. Ayesha, how much time do I have? I mean, to answer these two
we have to
questions.
finish at 11:30, so which, I mean, 11:30 my time, like 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Okay, I'll try to be very, very short because both are very important questions. And, you know, there's another question, but yeah, people have more questions than answers, you know, and we have to agree to that. Rajat, you have raised a very important question, and you know, I am against penalizing groups. Any thinking person would be against that because, you know, again, it's a question. I mean, if sex work is a crime, then all work is a crime because it is one of the most traditional of service sector, you know, that we have today. But the point is, you know, there are certain associations with sex work. It's not, you know, one of those glamorous Hindi film or Hollywood film, Pretty Woman kind of a situation. This also brings in huge amount of violence, huge amount of, you know, violations, both violence and violations, and tarnishing of human dignity. And these are the ancillaries that need to be addressed. So to throw bathwater with the baby with the bathwater out, we shouldn't be doing that. And sex workers demand the right to be recognized as people providing certain service, certain labor. And I think we should be mindful of that. If, you know, this term, sex work, came from the community. It was not something, unlike a lot of other terminologies, that was imposed on these communities. This is the terminology that the sex workers themselves came up with. And even in Bengali, we know that that is one terminology that they themselves wanted it for their, you know, dignity. And yes, I have many, you know, things, many stories that I could have talked about. And, you know, I talk about why trafficking, why the history of trafficking. The history of women's movement is based on subversion, where we have subversively and yet very tactically have used the notion of victimhood. If again you have no recourse to legality, you use the, you know, the identity of a victim, and you know how you will use it or not is very essential. Today, Black Lives Matter. it's based on this notion of victimhood of certain communities. And yet here we're talking about a Supreme Court justice being a Black and African-American woman today. And now the question is, people from the right wing are saying, so this person becomes justice because she is an African-American. No, that glass ceiling of African-Americanism was preventing people with the qualifications and the quality to be a justice. That glass ceiling is being removed, nothing else. In her own right, she could be a Supreme Court justice any day, but she was not allowed to be a Supreme Court justice because she's an African-American woman. So we are making the playing field a little more equal, nothing else. So in that way, yes, victimization have been used subversively, have been used tactically, and I have many, many stories of that. I myself spoke to a sex worker this time, a woman who's been trafficked, whose children she sent back home. And, she was so mad at being recognized as a victim that she took her money, went back to her in-laws' family, gave the money and said, this is for maintaining my children and for a caretaker to maintain yourselves. So, dare you call me a victim. But we have also tactically used the terminology of being a victim in among the trafficked population. And I would love to exchange stories with you. And we should actually get together and write something on that, how victimhood, like a lot of other mechanisms, can be a very subversive and a strong way of trying to change the course of history. So, I don't want to go beyond that, but it is a topic which is very close to my heart, because I think we, invariably put a lot of, color on these terminologies, which are much more creative terminologies. And it's not theoretically creative. Movements have used it creatively. So it's very, very important that we unearth this history of subversion.
Thank you very much, Paula, especially also in terms of there are no set repertoires of subversion. That is, you can take everything and make it a subversive, but it depends, of course, certain conditions. And I think this is also very important to underline, that as the kind of the labor aspect of that, the trafficked women, sex workers as the labor. And I think that connects us immediately to the question of the city, and then the providing services and providing, actually they are the dispossessed labor in the making of the cities. Our time is up, and I see that this conversation and discussion could go at least another hour, but unfortunately we don't have that time, and we are also we don't want to abuse the for India it is quite late at night, so we have to juggle all the time North America, South Asia, and different time zones. Thank you very much, Paula, for this very inspiring and theoretically rich within the ethnographic material that you have provided us. Thank you for joining us, and you will receive the information for the March talk in due time. So stay tuned to us, and we would like to see you, welcome you in the next months too. Thank you very much again, Paula. Have a nice day. Thank you. Bye.